Yep. Welcome to ScaledCon. This is our third panel of the day. It's on world building, how to create a consistent world. And we're going to introduce a guest. So, James L. Sutter, you're up first.
Hey everybody, I'm James Sutter, and you probably know me best from being a co-creator of the Pathfinder and Starfinder role-playing games. I was also the creative director on Starfinder. I ran the Pathfinder Tales novel line with Tor. I've also got a couple of novels, Death's Heretic and The Redemption Engine, both of which are Pathfinder novels that are kind of like Blade Runner meets Dante's Inferno. And then I've also written comics. I've written a bunch of video games. Most recently, the new Starfinder Alexa audio role-playing game, which the demo just came out, and so that's free. Um, yeah, I've written a lot of different stuff over the years, but world building is kind of my favorite part of it. Next.
Okay, Martin, you're up
Oh,
next.
me next. Yes, I'm a very minor writer. If you'd asked me, 4 years ago, I'd have just polished off 4 franchise books for like three for Paradox and one for a adventure series that was high profile at the time. I had a bit of a hiatus due to family stuff, but I'm back. I'm writing Lit RPG, God help me, for Connor Costing of Level Up, of more later. So I'm a kind of jobbing writer, aspiring pulpist, and swordsman and father, really.
What were the books for Paradox?
Um, oh, um, War of the Vikings and War of the Roses. So basically, two historical tales set in the 15th century, and one set in the I think it was 8th century.
Nice.
Strangely, there was a lot of violence.
Ree.
Hi, I am Ree Herman, and I am the most obscure one here because my debut fantasy novel, Love Bug, is due to be published in July from Joe Fletcher Books. So I am a fantasy novelist. Recently, I've been writing urban fantasy. I've also written theatrical plays, some of which had fantastical elements. But, yep, you've never heard of me because it's in July.
So people are getting in on the ground floor.
Absolutely, yes. You saw me when.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. So, first question is, where do you start when you're building a world? And I'm going to go in the reverse order this time. So, Ray.
Where do you start? Um, I often, I think there are different requirements depending on what you're building a world for, depending on the media in question. I think world building has different requirements, for example, depending on whether it's a book or a game or a movie, largely because they have different constraints. Um, of the three of them, a movie is the most constrained. It exists in a limited time. It's, you've got 2 hours to introduce and explain all your elements. A book, you have perhaps, 300 to 400 pages. And a game is in some ways effectively limitless because it's a setting for as many stories as you want. So where I would start would depend on what I was writing. And for me, these days, I'm mostly writing books, as I said. And the main place I start is from the story I want to tell, since a book is a single unit of story. And what world best expresses that story, whether it's urban fantasy story, which is much like the world of our own, except with magical elements, or a complete secondary world fantasy where everything is completely fantastical. It really, the requirements are given by the needs of what I'm trying to say in terms of what the tale, basically.
Okay, Martin.
Well, I mean, what Ray said, you create a world for a purpose. It's not generally a case of simulating something and seeing what stories come out of it. I suppose people have done that. I guess Tolkien did that. Um, so, remind me of the actual precise question because I got lost in what Ray was saying.
Where do you start?
Where do you start? Right. Well, what do you want? Essentially, what's it for? And that's really important. There are considerations that really matter. If you're going to use it again and again, you have to think about the long-term use of the world and make sure there's more stuff in it than the adventure you have in hand. If it's just a one shot, that's great. Just be creative. It doesn't even have to make sense. And you probably have to decide on what the tone is because you don't want to accidentally break it. Notoriously, Edgar Rice Burroughs, in his Mars books, put in the radium rifle, which is accurate at 100 kilometers and kills everything he hits and so on. And then he discovered he was writing a Sword and Planet series, and long-range sniper rifles don't really fit that. Luckily, he was able to just ignore the fact he put them in. You can't do that these days.
I kind of take a reverse approach where I actually do like to sometimes build a world and then ask myself, okay, what are the elements of this world that I'm most excited about, and how do I craft a story that can showcase them? When I'm building a world, I often try to think of it as like an intersectional thing, and so making sure that I have a couple of different tropes that I really enjoy, and then explore how sort of putting the two of them together can create something interesting. So it's not, I don't want to just say, okay, well, this is a dragon's book or this is a zombies book. Like you say, okay, well, what happens if you put dragons and zombies together? Like, how does that interact? And then suddenly you go, oh, well, that's Game of Thrones. That's already been done. But turns out it was a pretty good idea, And so I think oftentimes finding the ways in which two tropes can make you ask questions about the other one, like it gives you a much more interesting world if you can sort of follow those ramifications and say like, okay, well, if you do have dragons and zombies, like how do those interact? Why haven't the zombies eaten all the dragons? What do you get zombie dragons? Like riffing is really my way of building a world, and the best way to riff, sort of like with improv, is to ask questions. Just constantly be asking myself, why is it that way? Why is it that way? And I find that often takes me really far afield from whatever my seed pearl was.
Okay, thank you very much. Next one is, what is the most valuable tool for you when creating a consistent world? And I'm going to start off with Martin on this one.
History. For me, understanding how history works, or at least understanding how people behave in certain situations helps. I think maybe having a knowledge base of some kind is the most useful thing you can have. It needn't be history, it could be something else, sociology, anthropology, just something to do with people and the kind of world you're trying to build. My worlds tend to be quasi-historical or owe a lot to history. So that's my most useful tool.
Ray?
So if you're talking about simply consistency, simply keeping everything in the world you're building, logical and together, I find the most valuable tool is a beta reader. someone who will read your draft and say, on page 200 this happened, which on page 100 you explicitly said could never happen. So simply in terms of having a logical consistency to what is going on and what is happening, having other eyes on the work, having editors, basically, because you can become so close to something it can blind you, and you cannot realize that you've shifted away from something you originally said.
And yourself, James?
This is a hard one. There's a part of me that sort of wants to go the same route as Harold and say, being well read, going to other sources and getting inspired by whether it's other people's novels, Wikipedia, the History Channel, whatever. But I think that actually the most useful tool for me is just sort of knowing how to be creative on command and force myself through that fear of the blank page, and just saying, I am going to sit down and I'm going to put something on the paper. And it doesn't matter if it's good, it doesn't matter what it is, but forcing myself to fill that space, because inevitably, if I just start spitballing, you can build a world out of anything. You can start with any object in view, you can start with any idea, and then just spin out from there, usually leaving the original thing behind at some point. But I think that is actually the hardest part, is learning how to break that momentum or that inertia and gain momentum. And yeah, I think that's why I always end up comparing it to improv or jazz or some sort of musical jamming, because it's not really about sitting down and saying, I have this idea and I'm going to capture the idea perfectly out of my head. It's about, I'm just going to start creating and see what forms naturally. Like, I really can almost never do well, I'm just going to sit down and start at this part and then lay everything out. Like, it has to be this sort of free form thing for me. And I'm so sorry, Martin, I called you Harold because
I answer to Martin socially and Harold professionally. It gives me plausible deniability. Either will go. Yes, in a sense, what really the most useful tool of all is a computer where we can capture stuff and scribble things and look at what we wrote down, isn't it?
right. Actually, I guess if we're talking about tools, for me, it's probably just my phone, so that I've always got the little notes app, so that at any point, if I wake up in the middle of the night or if I'm out getting groceries or something and have an idea, the ability to just capture it immediately instead of having to try and hold it in my brain
I
is
actually,
deeply useful.
I actually still use a pen and paper for that. I just carry around a notebook wherever I go.
Nice.
I rely on Darwinian, like the thought will stay. I can't read my own handwriting anyway, so I'm just, if something pops into my head, if it's worth it, it'll come back.
I tried to believe that, and they never stayed. The ideas went, so I can't rely on that.
I always wanted to be one of those writers who carries around a little notebook. I had several coworkers, like Wes Schneider always made it look so cool, like one of those little nice Moleskine notebooks, and it's just perfectly full of all these maps and notes and everything, and it's this great artifact. And man, I can't do it. Every time I try to do it, I'd fill out like 3 pages, and then really it's either in my phone or it's 1,000 little bits of post-it notes and scratch paper strewn around my desk.
Oh, mine isn't pretty. Like, each page looks like someone dipped a spider in ink and let it run free.
Nice.
But it's there, and I could puzzle it out if I peer close enough.
I've worked from home for most of my professional life, so I've never had a need for a notebook like that. I can always bring up I use Scapple, it's a diagramming software, but I can always bring up something like that. It used to be Visio before that, to capture ideas on my computer and then go back to whatever boring day job I was doing. So in a sense, the notebook to capture ideas is important.
Thank you very much. So, for you, what is one thing that in things that you are reading or sort of consuming rather than writing that will break sort of suspension of disbelief in a world? And I'm going to start with you, James.
What is a thing that I see in other people's stuff that breaks my suspension of disbelief? God, I think the biggest thing in terms of world building is just when people don't explore the ramifications of whatever they've introduced, whether it's a magic system or a magical item or something. When somebody puts something in for the sake of the plot and doesn't consider how that would affect the world in general, because you would say, like, well, if that spell can do that, why haven't they used that to do this other thing, right? Like, if you can cast, if you can cast healing spells at will, why are people still dying of the plague or whatever? Now, that said, I think you can take that too far. I think it's important to remember that the point of the story is to have fun or to enjoy this experience. And so some people get too simulationist and want everything to be really real and thought out to the point where there's no longer adventure. I've seen a lot of, because I come largely from an adventure gaming background. Most adventures are fairly unrealistic in terms of character motivations. It's much easier if you want to get rich, it's much easier to stay home and, build an inn and cater to adventurers than to actually go out and fight a dragon, right? Most people would stay home. I would stay home, but that's not a really great story. Similarly, when I was working on Dungeon Magazine way back in the day, the first adventure of the Age of Worms adventure path, we had this big brouhaha on the message boards because we had a trap in the dungeon that shot like iron balls at people, like iron cannonballs, and it would just shoot a stream of them at you and fill up this big pit or whatever. And it was a fun trap, but some people on the message boards started doing the math and saying, well, iron is really valuable. So, here in this first room of the dungeon, we're just going to harvest all these iron balls and we're going to take them out and we're going to we make way more money just harvesting this than actually going on the adventure. And that was, we made some attempt to explore well, that would crash the local economy and now iron is not very valuable and all this stuff. But do you really want that, or do you want to go have a fun adventure, right? So I think you can go overboard with the simulationism, but I really love when people think about the ramifications of something outside of just the context it's in for the story. Max Gladstone is amazing at that, if you've read the Craft sequence.
Absolutely.
Anyway, that's my long-winded answer.
Okay, Ray, you're up next.
Like James, I'm willing to go a long way to roll with a story. I am not one of the people who reads the Narnia books and gets really upset that they have not got into the ramifications of how trade and farming works when winter has persisted for 1,000 years. I will roll with that. But there are things that can take me out of the story. Often it's when the implications of something major are just sort of ignored, midway through a story, oh, we discovered this stone that resurrects the dead, we'll use it to save our friend, and move on with the story, and it never comes up again. And that's wow. Wouldn't you want to use that a lot on everyone, and would that totally change the landscape of the world? So that kind of thing can break me. And another thing, which doesn't seem like it would be a world-building thing, but to me it is when characters behave in ways that make no sense. And not the way that, people sometimes, do things because they're people, but just no person would do that. And they do a thing solely to clearly push the story where the author wants it to go. That really just breaks my suspension of disbelief. And it is a part of world building because characters are part of the world. And so I need the people in the story to behave in a way that people would realistically behave, just to some extent.
Yeah. Can I jump in really quick and just add on something to that?
Sure.
Because I totally that's a big one for me as well. It's evil for the sake of evil just wrecks the story for me and can wreck a world for me, because both characters can be like that if your villain is blowing up the world just for the sake of mustache twirling. Or also when you have a country or a race that is evil, like the orcs are bad because orcs, is not nearly as interesting to me. And it's fine if the protagonist sees it that way, but you as the narrator need to have a better idea of why people are doing what they do.
My favorite villains are the ones that so there was a t-shirt that was going around a while ago that said Magneto made some valid points.
Right?
Yeah, that. The ones that are making valid points, that their motivation is I don't agree with them, but I understand where they're coming from. That really helps. That really helps a world for me a lot.
Someone did a typology of tyrants, and that's quite helpful.
What is that?
Um, I think there are 4 types: millenarian tyrants who want to like bring in the new millennium, reforming tyrants who have just taken control because they want to fix stuff. Usually, it's a lot harder to relinquish control when you've done that. Ones who are basically just crazies, and then the ones who are essentially good at stealing things and end up stealing an entire country and are handing out parcels to their friends. They're not usually very bright. But if you've got those 4 types in your head, it's a lot easier to come up with plausible bad guys.
That's really useful.
Yeah.
It's a good book. I'm trying to remember what it's called now. By a guy called Walter Newell.
Nice. Well, what's your answer, Martin? What?
Oh God, right. 15-pound broadswords. If you put a 15-pound broadsword in your story, I will mock you. Military things, where people win battles by charging harder, which admittedly sometimes works, where the ploughboy whose heart is true can beat the experienced swordsman. And I can tell you from experience, the experienced swordsman will dispatch the ploughboy in narrative summary in reality. But also where people haven't thought through the society implications of technology. A long time ago, I was beta reading a historical adventure story. It was a professional thing. It was so it'll remain nameless. But it was set in the Crusades, and they gave the English longbowmen, because English longbows, it's a trope. Robin Hood, all that stuff. Richard the Lionheart involved. And I said, well, you do realise you've broken the entire medieval history. Because when you've got longbows, you then suddenly the yeoman class, the upper class peasants, become important, and they can kill knights. When the peasants can kill knights, the battlefield tactics shift. They shift. Everything shifts, and the social structure shifts, because essentially the peasants now have RPGs, and you can't just hand out weapons because you think they're cool, because they imply an infrastructure behind them. Like you can't have a 6-foot long longsword without metallurgy. But also they imply human capability that will break the entire system around you. The other thing I really dislike is where people behave outside the constraints and thinking of their society with no consequences. This is trope more in films, where very often it's the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or whatever, and there's a girl, but she's feisty, so she can break all the rules, and that's okay. It's like, if it was that easy, women would have broken the rules, because patriarchy is horrible. It has its own correctives. And it's the same with everything else. Oh, I'm a peasant, but I can break the rules of social class. No, you're not. Someone will kill you. Pre-modern oppressive societies are oppressive not because people weren't strong or brave or bold, because history is full of strong women and peasants who had willpower and people trying to liberate themselves. But there's active things that will step in and stop you. And if you ignore that, not only are you breaking the world, which I find because then I no longer believe in it, but also you're erasing all the suffering and effort of the people in the past. You're going, oh, well, if only women had been a bit more feisty, they could have got rid of patriarchy in the 15th century. No, they couldn't. And the same goes for anything else, So yeah, I don't like it when people think anachronistically, because I think it breaks the world, and then I stop believing it.
Interesting. Although, I will. You said a really interesting thing there about anachronism, which is one of the things that drives me nuts is when people apply real-world anachronism to a fantasy world, and they say, "Well, you can't do that because that's not how it works, or that's not how it really happened." And and the answer is like, "Well, we also didn't have wizards riding dragons, but we can make." Now, that's very different than saying, what Martin's saying, which is, if this were different about your world, then a whole bunch of other things would be different as well. Like, that's a really valid criticism, but just saying that's not how it was for us, and therefore it can't be that way for anybody. Like, I feel like that often is a thing that people get into.
And
there is a thing.
Sorry.
There is a thing that there are some ideas that don't require much physical technology to back them. A good modern example is the container ship. We conceivably could have had shipping containers maybe, like quite early in the 20th century, if not before. And once you have them, everything around that changes. And in military technology, what if we got all these angry peasants and got them to stand close together with long weapons? And you invent the polearm phalanx, and history changes, but it's just an idea. So there's no reason why you can't take that into a fantasy world and go, yes, I know it looks medieval, but they're using this or that. So yeah, no, I agree with you.
And to quickly address, I want to quickly address 2 points that have been brought up. The first is this one, which is I've read some very interesting books which actually try to explore that. Like, if something changes, how does society change around it? And I can think of one series of books by James Fletcher, in which basically randomly a certain percentage of children born were sorcerers who were super powerful compared to normal humans and could basically destroy them with a thought. And one of the knock-on effects of this, which was very interestingly explained, was that sexism vanished in this world. Because you never knew if your daughter at the age of 13 might suddenly become super powerful. And so that distinction just vanished, and the only distinction left was between sorcerers and non-sorcerers.
Sure.
And another quick thing I want to address, which was brought up very early on about military inaccuracy, is I read a fascinating blog recently by a military historian who was analyzing various movies and books. And one of the things he did was explain how cavalry charges actually work. And now I cannot watch cavalry charges in shows without going, you're doing it wrong. Because the way they always show it with them overrunning the line of infantry is exactly the wrong way to do it and would get them all killed.
Sure, yeah.
In Lord of the Rings, where the cavalry are poised to ride down on the orcs with the pikes. And I was sitting in the cinema and I was like, no, please, you're going to knock me out of the film. I won't believe it anymore. And then Gandalf goes, no, you're all blind. And then the cavalry charged home. And it's like, yes, I can believe that. But I couldn't believe a frontal assault on pikes. It's been done, I think, maybe a couple of times in history. It's not something you'd ever contemplate. And they had considerably more armor when they did it, I think, as well.
I have the same thing with any longsword fight, having studied under that man there and that man there, being Harold Page, who was my first longsword instructor.
Nice.
It's like, can't watch it.
You know, and I think it's important for people to recognize that you don't need to know everything about everything. You know, you don't need to be a geologist to draw a good map. You don't need to be a military, historian or, combat specialist in order to write good stuff like that. You just need to do some basic Googling, 20 minutes of Googling around for, people's pet peeves about fight scenes will tell you a whole lot, right? Like, because you don't, like, if you can write with great experience, like, that's awesome. But usually it's enough to just, say, okay, well, I don't want you to be making the top level mistakes. Like, please don't, you don't need to rack that shotgun again. You, in fact, really shouldn't rack that shotgun again, every time you need to make a point or whatever. You're just ejecting shells every time you make a point. Like, it's not hard to do the basic due diligence. And so that's kind of where I would always start.
Also, beta readers, they're great.
Oh, yeah.
I've got a couple of ex-military friends, and there's one guy who's, I think he's ex-special forces, I know via Twitter. And he's great because I could just go, right, so here's the situation. This is what I think he should do. What would you do? One time it was a bit disconcerting. He was like, oh, that's interesting. And I suddenly realized he'd quite like to do that tactical situation I set up. And I was thinking of someone who's quite different from the person that I am.
Well, and you never know what your beta reader is going to bring to something. I had a beta reader recently who read a thing that I'd written and came back and said, so you clearly don't know anything about women's fashion, do you? And I was like, no. And she was like, because you really, like, there are more tops in the world than just blouses, like it's like, I don't even know. I literally sat down and had to have people help me make a list of, like, what are the different clothing types called? Because for me, it's like, I have pants and a shirt, and every, that's what I know, right? Like, maybe a skirt. That's all I got to work with. So everybody can bring something to that.
Okay, so we've had some of the pet peeves. What are some of the favorite things that you have seen and maybe even actually done in your work when it comes to creating something consistent? What's the secret sauce?
Well, honestly, I feel like those are almost two different questions of like what are my favorite things and what makes something consistent, because one of the things that I love in a book or a movie is a lot of different settings that feel really different. Like Dan Simmons' Hyperion series, I fell in love with when I was maybe 12, and one of the reasons that I fell in love with it is because, especially in the third and fourth books, there's just so many different settings that they sort of hop through these portals and take this grand tour, and every one of them feels like a fully realized setting. And so that realization that I could get half a dozen really interesting worlds in the same book was this sort of revelation for me, because it felt like I was getting, the ice cream cone with a scoop of every flavor on it, right? And I feel like there's some value to that. I get bored easily, so I like to have a bunch of different stuff. Um, but in terms of consistency, I think maybe it's just a matter of thinking about how all your different cultures interact and your peoples interact with each other, right? Like it's not that you want every city to be the same, and in fact you should have every city in your world feel different, right? It should have its own culture, it should have its own quirks. But thinking about how they all interact with each other and think about each other can go a long way towards helping it feel like a cohesive whole. I don't know, what do you guys think?
Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great thing to shoot for. I think you always want to avoid the kind of, I've heard it called the planet of hats problem, where
Right.
you go down to a planet and it's one culture, everyone wears the hat. That's their culture.
I literally have one of those in my traveller campaign.
Well,
They all have hats. It's one of and they grow
the
fungus.
literal planet of hats. Okay, that's cool to play with too. Um, but so making a world feel um, fully realized and full of variety, the kind of thing you brought up. Max Gladstone, all his cities have a different feel to them. Tolkien famously created this entire history of his entire world. um, in terms of what I like to write, I think I tend to be a bit more character focused, and I like to think about how what is going on affects the people, affects their emotions and their relations and their interactions, and the consistency for me sort of springs from that. If there are, for example, vampires and werewolves, how that affects, what do they do on a day-to-day basis? How do they deal with that? How do they deal with each other? How does it affect their interactions with each other and the world? And just thinking through all the implications in terms of what is this person feeling? What is this person doing on a day-to-day basis? And that's a lot of where I get the world and where I get the story comes from that, comes from the impingement of the world on the people.
I'm somewhere between the two of you, but not in the biblical sense. I think on the one hand, I like a world when reading. I admire settings where it's set up so you can have lots of different sorts of adventures, but maybe with a single connecting flavor. So Jack Vance, the Dying Earth series, for instance, in no way is Dying Earth a complicated, nuanced world that's been set up with economy and trade and stuff. It's a scattering of different civilizations across maybe quite an empty planet, but it's set up such that the characters can walk through Dying Earth having proto D&D adventures. It's awesome. The Traveller universe, I don't mean necessarily the Imperium, but the original Traveller books with the ability to just generate a subsector of random planets. And again, it's set up probably inspired by E.C. Tubbs' Dumarest series, where isolation is the theme, like in a Western. So each planet is kind of separated socially and economically from the ones around it, except for maybe some trade. And when you arrive, it might be the Planet of the Hats because it's only got a population of 1,000 because that's what you rolled up. And creatively, that's interesting because it's a bit like reading the tarot. You have a set of statistics, and you have to go. It's a moon, but it's got no air, but it's not got the technology to maintain its own air conditioning system and environmental systems, and it has a cultural quirk. Roll dice, art. So I ended up with an artist colony on a moon. This it was in alien tunnels, and it was in the fourth generation. It was beginning to fall apart politically, even though there's only like 100 core people there. They're all fractioning and so on. So I like settings that support that kind of rolling adventure. When it comes to books, and I suspect with role-playing scenarios, though I tend to handcraft my own, the best realized worlds are the ones where the conflicts impact on the hero, but very specifically, each layer of the world impacts on the hero. So the best example of them all are the Sharp books, Bernard Cornwell. And I know it's not really world building because it's historical, which always has an advantage that it's not going to go horribly wrong, except if you're caught out. So you have different layers in that world. You have like the French, you have class, you have the army as a structure, you have interpersonal conflicts. And in the middle of all this is Sharp. And he has a connection with each of these different layers of his world. So he has some sort of interaction with the Duke of Wellington, for God's sake. He fights the French, but he's got to deal with the toffee-nosed gits who want to put him down. He's after the girl, but she's actually a Spanish, so he's involved with in a conflict with the leader of the local resistance. And the entire world is perceived through all these conflicts. And I think there's a general rule in all created worlds. Snipers in the rooftops, right, in the belfries. If you want people to take note of your belfries, you could write beautiful long descriptions. People will just skip that. Say, I think there might be a sniper up there. Oh no, hang on a second, that's a carved griffin. What about that over there? No, yeah, stick a sniper in the belfry. And that's what Bernard Cornwell pulls off. So that would be the most impressive, I think, depiction of a world. And the best world building for me maybe is the Traveller system.
Can I throw out one other technique that I find really useful, which is, I think, thinking about a world in terms of environmental pressures and natural selection and adaptation and all those things, not just for biology, but socially as well. Like, always be asking sort of the question of why the society you have is, or that you want, is a direct response to its environmental pressures. You know, everything has a reason why the way it is. And so if you can figure out what the reasons are that led you to create this particular society, it makes that society feel much more real. And conversely, you can also start out with the conditions and figure out what sort of society would arise from it by simply applying that idea of adaptation. You know, like if you've got this, if you've got a desert, you know, you're going to figure out that society is going to have a whole lot of adaptations for living in the desert. But conversely, if you've got a flying city, there better be a reason why that city is flying, because it's really expensive and difficult to make a city fly. You know, and there's, you know, and so immediately you start riffing and saying like, okay, well, maybe it's flying because it doesn't want to be part of any of the terrestrial nations. It's, you know, flying through all their airspace, so it can't be controlled. Or maybe it's because the ground is, you know, poisonous or filled with dangerous, you know, zombie antelope, whatever, you know. I feel like that those principles are pretty much 50% of my world building.
And to bring that to, so I write, as I said, urban fantasy. And to bring it back to pet peeves, one thing that drives me crazy in some urban fantasies is when wizards and warlocks and magical creatures are common and it has changed nothing.
Right, right.
It is exactly the same as the world outside your window, except your neighbor is a wizard and can, you know, light entire buildings on fire by flicking their hand. And I always think that would change something. Something in history would change. Something in culture would change.
Yes. True Blood, right? There's a character in it called Eric Northman, who is a Viking. I mean, they have flashbacks to him being a Viking. He's a vampire, so he's an immortal vampire Viking. And in the TV series, because he's this blonde Aryan Viking type, he has all these kind of groupies that are sort of want to worship him, kiss his boots and stuff, right? I can tell you, as a HEMA person, historical European martial arts, the Viking combat art has been lost to us. No one ever documented it. He would be mocked by people like me going, come on, sword and shield. Look, here's my sister. You can have her blood. Now just show me how to do sword and shield Viking style, okay? And that's the first, they always ignore those sorts of implications. This gateway to the past, that would always be coming up.
Well, and and the flip side being like, if you're anybody who lives forever is going to be incredibly rich because it's really easy to get rich by just investing and waiting a long time, right? Like, and so I always think of, and not that, vampires haven't traditionally been portrayed as rich, but like, it's fun if you have that explanation of like, oh, why is Dracula rich? Well, index funds. Like that's why he's rich, right? Like
In my second novel, which is coming out sometime next year, I did have a vampire who lost everything in the Great Depression.
Right? Yeah, and like that stuff is fun. Like playing with the second and third order ramifications of anything unusual you add into your world is where the fun comes from. Like for a lot of folks, I mean, not to downplay character and story, because like everybody cares about character and plot, but when it comes to a world, the most interesting parts are the ramifications of whatever your central idea or tweak is. If you change something, ask yourself, how does that change, the economy and, religion and taboos and social structure and just, every level of everything is probably going to get affected in some way if you have a big change. Anyway, we've gone on for a while.
Yeah, no, this is great. This is all.
Oh, no, you're muted.
Really interesting.
Tix, hello.
Yes, it's mostly so that I don't corpse and kind of spoil what you're saying. But this is great. This is really interesting. How do you feel that landscape, actual physical landscape, how important is that in your world building process?
Hugely. Landscape, I mean, if you want to talk about landscape is emotional, and how you describe it evokes emotion, and how it impinges on the characters, changes how they view things and how they are viewed. And they can be described in different ways. I mean, a city can be bleak and harsh. A city can be beautiful and vibrant, and that can be the same city. The same with a desert. A desert can be an arid, desolate landscape, or it can be filled with surprising, hardy life. And landscape can make your story gothic. It can make your story urban. It can make your story empty if you set it, in the middle of a wilderness where you're struggling for survival. Landscape always affects character. It always affects world. And a variety of landscape is something that's a lot of fun to play with in writing anything, in creating anything.
Martin, you want to go for it?
Landscape shapes strategy, shapes politics, and in a pre-modern world, people are the landscape. I mean, people who live in the hills are part of the landscape. The landscape shapes them, and they're in opposition to the landscape, another conflict. So I suppose it's integral in that sense. I'm perhaps more interested in it strategically, because I perhaps like to set up geopolitical situations. And historically, landscape has shaped everything. There's a very good book by a geographer claiming the West's early advantage was entirely just to do with being slightly closer to America, and before that being geographically more broken up, so we had lots of crappy little kingdoms all fighting each other and developing technology. And that's just the landscape creates the people, creates the history.
Yeah, I mean, it's that classic geography is destiny thing, right?
Yeah.
And I definitely think about geography, as we were talking about earlier, in how the different environmental pressures can shape the people and the settlements, and also sort of thinking about how you can use that to inspire yourself. Like I think about when I was designing Kyonin for Pathfinder, I was doing a gazetteer of our Elven nation, and all we knew about it is, my colleagues said, "All right, here's the Elven nation. It's basically one big forest. Go." And so you can either treat that like Endor in Star Wars and just say, okay, it's just one big forest. But if you zoom in, on any forest, you'll see that sort of environment is fractal. And so if you zoom in on a forest, you'll see that within that forest, there are clearings and there are streams and there are different elevations. So you've got swamps and you've got hills and all these things. And it's important to recognize that because that allows you to have variety within what looks from a distance like a monoculture, because now suddenly your elves who live next to the waterfall, well, they've got, water wheels and all sorts of hydraulic power through their settlement, whereas the elves who live up on, the side of the cliff where the forest slants steeply, well, they're living in cliff dwellings with, like wooden balconies hanging off of everything. And, like thinking about how the environment shapes people is really important. But I also think that the environment kind of more to what you were saying, Ree, like the emotional element of an environment is really important to capture in a story or a game, because I feel like the desire for exploration is a lot of why I read science fiction and fantasy. Like I am not an explorer. I do very chill, timid hikes compared to a lot of people, but that feeling of wanting to know what's over the horizon, of being inspired by the majesty and the drama and the sense of there could be something cool right over there. Um, I think that capturing that is a whole lot of what makes people want to inhabit your world, like not just as a backdrop for the story, but getting invested in the world itself. Like I always, if I'm setting a scene, whether in a story or a game, I want the players or the readers to be thinking, God, I wonder if there's the ruins of a castle off on that distant mountain over there. That feeling of longing to explore is really important, and especially in gaming where you're trying to get the player to help you tell a story. I've so many times had players come up to me at conventions and go, oh man, we've been playing in that lost city you created for the last 2 years, and we've had this huge campaign, and like we love it so much. And I'm thinking, I wrote 2 sentences about that lost city, like in passing. I just said, over there is this lost city of blah, blah, blah. But you had questions about it, and you went and answered those questions for yourself. And yet you're giving me the credit, right? Like that's a pretty sweet deal as an author, right? So I think the power of illusion and mystery and not revealing everything about the landscape can be really powerful.
And I think that can play in for, because in a game there can be many different reasons to explore. And this kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier as to why are you going adventuring when it would be easier to collect the iron balls.
Right.
I think some of the best games are the ones that give characters very, very powerful motivations to do that, that fits in with that make the players want to do that. And it can be all sorts of things. It can be that spirit of exploration. And speaking of Pathfinder, I'm playing Strange Aeons right now,
Oh, nice.
and we don't really want to go into the next room.
Right.
Strange Aeons, for those who don't know, is, if I may say so, Pathfinder's foray into the Cthulhu mythos.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And so there's probably something horrible in that next room.
Yeah.
And it starts out in, a creepy asylum where you want to huddle in a room and cry, but you have lots of motive. You need to get to that next room. You need to find out what's going on. It's desperately important. And that push and pull, that tension that you don't want to go, but you have to, actually
Yeah.
makes an excellent game.
Nice.
It's a lot of fun to play with that, with those conflicting motivations.
Totally.
Well, I think I'm going to hand it over to some questions now. We only really have one attendee in at the moment. People have dropped in and dropped back out again.
Oh.
So we have
All
Justin
right,
remaining.
Justin, you got a private panel here. Ask us anything.
Been listening in to what you guys have been saying, but I'm not sure I have any questions. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm juggling
You're in Texas
multiple things,
wardrobe,
but I've
aren't you?
also been setting things up on Discord. I need to make sure I'm not spamming their chat. Right. No. There's been quite a lot of talk about kind of convincing and verisimilitude and things. What would you say you guys have got as little kind of hacks to kind of make people want to believe, so they'll kind of give you a pass on something? If there's something you really want to put in and you're like, not sure I can get away with this, what do you tend to do to kind of sell them? Go on, let me have it. Let me have it.
You know, there's a trick that I think Mary Robinette Cole was talking about on their podcast Writing Excuses a while back, where if you if you have something where you can explore, she was sort of like talking about kind of like winning the reader's trust. And so if you can take a particular subject or aspect of the world or whatever that might have a hard time getting people on board, either because they don't understand it, or they don't believe that it would work. If you can dive into it once early in the story and really spell out exactly how it works and why it makes sense and everything, um, whether that's spelling out sort of how your character knows about X and Y, or explaining some idea. If you can do it well once early, then you can get away with just sort of hand waving it later on, because you've already shown people like, yes, I know about this, right? And so I think her example was talking about like writing a book about the space program, providing some really good detail early on about rockets and how they work and whatnot, sort of establishes the narrator's credibility in the reader's mind is like, okay, well, they clearly know about rockets, so then when they say this other thing 100 pages later, I'm just going to believe that that is true, that makes sense, because they already showed us once that something made sense. Um, so I think like sort of earning the credibility in one way can let you sort of hand wave in others. I don't know, what do you guys think?
I've
Kind of
almost been,
foreshadowing
sorry.
competence, is that it, really?
Yeah, actually, that's a good way to put it. But Ree, you were saying?
I've almost been doing the opposite lately in some of my writing, because I've become very interested in the idea of magic as numinous and a little incomprehensible.
Mm.
And to be clear, I love very clear-cut magic systems. I love Brandon Sanderson.
Sure.
Role-playing games where your fireball takes up this much space and does 10d6 damage. But I'm also very interested in the idea that magic can break the rules and cannot be comprehensible and can be something which can't really be explained. So one way I've done that with the I don't really need to explain this all the way, is to sort of introduce that element that this is a thing which is not completely explicable, because it is magic, because it does not obey the laws of nature, because it does not work in a logical way, but in a metaphorical way, in a supernatural way. And I've been playing with that a lot, and I quite like what's happened with that, with doing that.
That's sort of the classic hard magic, soft magic divide, right? Like soft magic, hard magic people tend to be harsh on soft magic, but I think soft magic is totally valid, um, because it's creating it, like you say, that sense of mystery and wonder, and like that's really useful as long as you don't use it to do
As
a
a, as
Deus
a
Ex
get out of
Machina.
yeah, as a get out of any situation free card. Yeah.
But also,
Yeah, exactly.
historical magic is soft magic. It's batshit crazy. I have
Oh yeah.
translations of the Greek magical papyri on my shelf, and it's got rituals for getting your own shadow as an assistant demon, or visiting a god
Nice.
in heaven. It's bonkers stuff, and it never, it doesn't give you stats. What you're both talking about is, I think, something that I lean heavily on is the power of story. So if you have something bonkers, there's an explanation for it, and the explanation has to be interesting. And so, perhaps you're wondering why there's a flying city on which a zombie dragon lives, guarding the animated corpses of possessed elves. Well, let me tell you. And so, if your exposition is a story in its own right, not only does the exposition itself become interesting, very Herodotean, isn't it? But also the readers trust you that not only will there be an explanation for the next crazy thing you serve up, but that it will be interesting. So by telling a good story, what Robert Noel was saying, I think, is by telling a good story in the first place about something, you're trusted to deliver more good stories. And so when something crazy comes up, people go, oh, great, I bet there's a really good explanation for this.
Right, yeah.
It's a very 18th century style of writing. There's a book, Saragossa manuscript, quite famous, which is all nested. It's an 18th century picaresque novel. It's all nested stories. So it'll be, perhaps you're wondering why I, a cavalier, am by the roadside, stark naked, except for a church bell and a goat. Well, and that's it. What drives it is sheer curiosity rather than conflict. And that, I think, works. So that's kind of what you're both talking about, I think, put together. Whether I've used that or not, I don't know. Now I'm sitting here panicking.
I really want to, I have to say, I really want to know what that cavalier is doing there and why.
Now I have to go write that.
Well, thank you very much. I am going to wrap up the recording here. You're free to hang out and chat for a bit longer. So thank you very much to James L. Sutter, M. Harold Page, and Marie Herman for joining us at ScaledCon for the panel.
Thank you very much for having us.